Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's second panel of our Joint Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and Canadian Journal of Emergency Management webinar. My name is Alexander Landry, and I'm a research fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, as mentioned this morning. Today, I have the pleasure of moderating this insightful discussion regarding Canadian Armed Forces domestic commitments, particularly in the context of responding to emergencies. So as we're shifting our focus from the broader challenges of the Arctic region to the vital role of CAF in emergency management, we'll be exploring the complexities and responsibilities associated with requests for assistance, colloquially termed as RFAs, which you'll hear a lot about over the next 90 minutes. The CAF have long been a cornerstone of our national response to crises, providing essential support during natural disasters, search and rescue missions, and other emergency situations. However, with the growing frequency and severity of such events, particularly in the harsh and rapidly changing Arctic environment, there's an increasing strain on our military resources. So today we're going to delve into the current capabilities and limitations of the armed forces in responding to these RFAs, the strategies needed to alleviate the burden on our military, and the potential for enhanced collaboration between governmental and non-governmental organizations. Our discussion is also going to address the broader implications for national security, sovereignty, as well as the well-being of northern communities, but also just vulnerable and remote communities at large. As always, we're encouraging you to actively participate by submitting your questions to the chat function. As you saw this morning, I was quick to answer the questions as they came in, and I'll address as many as I can, either directly via answer text or live with the panelists as we go through today's 90 minutes. To guide us through the critical conversation today, we have a panel of esteemed experts who bring a wealth of experience and insight into operational, strategic, and policy dimensions of military support in emergency management. So we're fortunate to have a distinguished panel of experts with us today who can share their perspective and analysis. With me to discuss these topics are Dr. Christian Leuprecht, Dan Doran, and Shawna Bruce. So Dr. Leuprecht is a professor in leadership with Royal Military College's Department of Political Science and at Queen's University. Notably, he's a recipient of RMC's Cowan Prize for Excellence in Research, an elected member of the College of New Scholars of the Royal Society of Canada, and an avid publisher regarding Canadian Armed Forces commitments, including with the Canadian Military Journal. And I've been involved with him in that regard to some effect, which we're glad to have him today. Dan's currently the Director and National Practice Lead in Defense and Security for KPMG. He's also an Army Reservist with the Royal Canadian Engineers, in which role he has deployed in several domestic operations. He holds a graduate degree from Royal Roads in Human Security and Peace Building, and was president of the Quebec Council of St. John Ambulance, and is an honorary patron of the International Forum for Peace, Security, and Prosperity. I'm glad to have him here as a fellow engineer as well, so it's good to have you aboard. And Shawna is a former Canadian Armed Forces Public Affairs Officer who is the National Public Affairs Leader for Global Petrochemical Company after retirement from the Army. Shawna is now a graduate of the Disaster and Emergency Management Program at Royal Roads University and has developed and instituted crisis communications at post-secondary institutions across Canada as a co-instructor with the Alberta Emergency Management Agency as well. She now delivers workshops and provides advice and guidance to prepare municipalities, industry, and organizations to keep the community safe and informed through effective communications during emergencies and crises. So it'll be good to have that aspect of consideration today on board with our panel. So I'm really delighted to have you all join me for this webinar with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and Canadian Journal of Emergency Management and the like. Without further ado, let's dive into the discussion. So thanks for being here today. So it's really no secret this has been a topic of note not only for the CAF, but also for the Canadian public over the course of the past couple of years. As emergency incidents requiring CAF response become more prominent, including in terms of floods and wildfires, we know the discussion is timely. Setting the scene, I believe the audience would benefit from knowing about your background in this regard and what really brings you to the webinar today. So please, Dr. Leuprecht, glad to have you aboard. Let us know a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so as you know, I did a book recently called Polar Cousins. When I spent a sabbatical in Australia, it became clear that many of the issues, questions, debates, concerns that people had about the Antarctic were similar to some of the discussions about the Arctic. Of course, the governance and the treaty systems are different. But so one of my efforts has been to try to get us to think not just about the Arctic, but to think about both poles. And in particular, thinking about polar security as global security, given the pace of change. And many of you will be familiar with a policy paper I did with Peter Kasarak early on in the pandemic on domestic deployments, and also currently working on a volume on domestic deployments by militaries, in particular during the pandemic, but also more broadly as a result of climate change and the like, with my colleague Lindy Heineken in South Africa, a military sociologist, where we have 27 countries and allied and partner countries from all regions of the world, because this is a discussion that we're having not just in Canada. I mean, the uniqueness in Canada is the Arctic and the northern aspect, but of course, those apply to many of our allies, including New Zealand, the United States, Australia, and so forth when it comes to the Antarctic. So there's lots of overlap here, both on the domestic operations side as well as the broader security side and the polar security side in particular.
Of course, and I appreciate that insight, and it's something we'll discuss for sure, because I think Canada's geography definitely defines it and differentiates it from other nations. Specifically, in previous webinars, we've discussed, like, why Canada doesn't have necessarily a FEMA, for example, but, the geography comes at large, and I think we'll discuss this as we get into to the discussion further here. Dan Doran, pleased to have you aboard. Please, your background.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Alex. So yeah, as you indicated in my intro, like, kind of my background touches on a bunch of different elements related to climate security, emergency incident response. So sort of a master of none, but been able to dip my toe in a lot of different areas related to what we're talking about today. So on an academic side, I've spoken with the CDA Institute on emergency response and have written some pieces on climate change and climate security. On the civil society side, where I was on the board for St. John Ambulance, that was particularly interesting and informative, certainly during the COVID crisis, where we had St. John Ambulance volunteers deployed to the CHSLDs, which were the elderly care homes throughout the province for months and months on end, which was a very interesting employment of civil society during that time, where they were actually paid for their services, but mobilized for that purpose. And then lastly, as a practitioner, having deployed as an engineer squadron commander on 3 aid to civil power operations, 2 floods, and the elderly care home crisis, and then commanding a 4th as commander of the territorial battalion group in Montreal when we actually did the vaccine rollout. So again, thrilled to be here, because this panel really brings together 3 topics that I'm really passionate about, which is civil society, the Canadian Reserves, and climate security. So I hope my experiences that I feel have informed a number of my thoughts on these subject areas will be helpful in the discussion and panel today. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, and I do appreciate that, the discussion on climate security, and specifically, I can see a lot of our participants and attendees in the audience do come from a background. I won't make any shout-outs, but I know that the Climate Security Association of Canada is represented right now. To this effect, I think, the overlap, as you mentioned, that we're going to discuss, the St. John Ambulance Humanitarian Workforce Program, also Canadian Reserves, but also climate security at large, will be pertinent in the discussion today. So pivoting to that, Shawna, glad to have you aboard, and really excited to have some crisis communications insight, because I think it's a part that we don't necessarily discuss as much as we should when it comes to disaster and emergency management response, but even preparedness and after the fact. So glad to hear about your background a little bit here and what brings you to this panel today.
Well, thank you, Alexander, and thank you for inviting me to join this esteemed group to have this discussion. I feel that I'm sort of always maybe at the more pointier end of this stick, deployed on various domestic operations while in the Canadian Forces, working in that public affairs capacity and looking at ways to profile what our soldiers were doing in response to supporting community calmness, if I could say, because that's what the military does when they come into a community that's facing these crises, is they are bringing a sense of calm, really. But on the other side of that, I feel now my work is really generated around working with communities to prepare them in that phase, to have how to communicate once a disaster hits, or to get them ready to prepare and what they need to be looking at. And I have a lot of discussions with groups on what does that emergency management framework, how do we manage this more locally? How can we ensure we create and sustain a community holistic approach to emergency management if we are seeing the federal government looking at sort of a FEMA-like approach in that? So I think there's lots of various discussions that I am an active listener in. Also on that other side, I have a daughter that is up in the north and in the territories who travels up. I was there last summer when we were pretty much evacuated out of the wildfires, seeing that firsthand and having my own questions about sovereignty and the safety of Canada in that regard, if we continue to deploy our Canadian Armed Forces for these requests that seem to be happening at a more frequent in a more frequent timeline. So in all of this to say, I do think communication is a key thread to all of the conversations, whether it's interoperability to how we are talking public information and sharing risk. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what my other colleagues on this panel have to share today. Thank you.
Great. I'm looking forward to that discussion as well. And, the personal experience you bring, I think, is a big motivator for everyone on this panel and any event that IPD or CGIM has run before. So this joint collaboration today really should be a bit of a cross-pollination, as I mentioned this morning, between different networks, be they in policy, foreign affairs, or even domestic considerations, and the policy practitioners and scholars on the disaster and emergency management side of the house, which are a key. The engagement's key overall as we go. But I want to pivot a little bit so we can just kind of set the scene here. I think one of the framework questions then really is in regards to addressing the current capabilities the Canadian Armed Forces has, because that's the crux of the issue, and it's really the overhead with the Mobilizing Insights in Defense and Security program that has the auspices for this webinar today. So I'll start with Dr. Leuprecht and then go to Dan and then Shawna. Dr. Leuprecht, you've done extensive research on the evolution of CAF over time. I've read some of it, as you mentioned, and you've highlighted some of it. Can you speak to the current capabilities for the CAF in responding to emergencies in support of provinces and territories, and what the gaps exist? Like, we've seen this evolve over time. It's been a topic of discussion in regular media, social media, and whatnot. But specifically, when we talk about capabilities, like, where does that look at the moment, and how can we address that?
So you know that a lot of my colleagues have been expressed great concern, including in front of parliamentary committee, about sort of the use and overuse of the Canadian Armed Forces for domestic deployments. And I think that issue is actually more nuanced than I think the critics make it out to be. And I think that nuance is probably important, to pick up, for instance, on Dan's point at the reserves. So we have a special issue on the reserves forthcoming later this year in the Canadian Military Journal. Often the reserves are not particularly well understood as an organization, but there are assets about the reserves in the sense that, for instance, they're nicely distributed across the country. There are drawbacks in the sense that you can't force them to deploy. You have high turnover in the reserves. You have some training issues within the reserves, in particular, sort of after COVID. So all that to say is there's sort of some interesting debates and pros and cons. Let's also consider how the Canadian Armed Forces ended up with this task, right? So that in 1952, after World War II, the Air Force, when there was a debate about, should we create a separate organization or not, the military and the Air Force in particular were quite happy to take on this task on the premise that it was going to be a very sort of small task that they were going to be able to do the side of their desk. And the reason they took it on is because it meant if you have the domestic sort of capabilities and the search and rescue and the military capabilities, now you have a critical mass of pilots that you can train. Whereas otherwise you would have had a much smaller organization, and then you lose some of that critical mass. So some of this is also Canadian Armed Forces said we wanted to take this on, of course, under very different circumstances, where we didn't realize, the organization perhaps didn't quite realize the quantity, quality, and complexity of the deployments that would await them. And this, of course, in a context where the armed forces really for the last 25 years have been significantly undercapitalized, and you might also say significantly overused, sometimes perhaps to the right effect and sometimes to the wrong effect. But what is clear is that the quality of the deployments is changing in terms of the number of elements that the Canadian Armed Forces need to deliver. The quantity is changing. It's changing both in the number of deployments as well as the length of those deployments. The Air Force was on duty in British Columbia for over half a year in response to the wildfire situation. And one might argue that that was not necessarily for real first responder reasons, but was for political reasons. On the one hand, it is sort of the Canadian Armed Forces are the easy button that the federal government can push relatively quickly because it controls sort of all these assets. It is the one organization that has an operational sort of real substantial operational capability. Most other departments just write checks and do sort of tactical things, and they do strategic policy. So when the government wants to show the flag, this is sort of the easy way to do it, and the complexity of the operations. And so, you might say that in the context where we have equipment that is already significantly challenged, where we have significant staffing challenges for the organization, domestic operations add a significant strain. Also, if you consider that much of the equipment that the Canadian Armed Forces deploys on these domestic operations isn't equipment that's really ideally suited for domestic operations, right? So you take a military helicopter and you show up with that helicopter, and then people on the ground are surprised that you can't put the payload on that helicopter that you might like to put on that helicopter, because the military has already outkitted that helicopter with all sorts of other stuff that you can't just readily take on and off the helicopter. But the helicopter is a great showpiece, because if you look at, for instance, what happened in British Columbia, the television cameras always gravitate towards the military helicopter. You'll have dozens of private contractors and so forth that are providing similar or more frequent types of services, but they don't get the attention. The military sort of gets all the attention. So I guess it's a good showcase sort of for taxpayers. As Shawna says, it provides sort of a sense of relief for local populations that the military is there. But the question is this really the best use and deployment of resources? I'll give you a counterexample where I thought the Canadian Armed Forces were ideally used, which was the evacuation of Yellowknife in the wildfire circumstances. This is exactly what we need the Canadian Armed Forces to do. There's no other organization in the country that can provide lift capacity, can provide that type of planning capacity, and in particular do it to vulnerable communities. Same way that the Canadian Armed Forces, for instance, used its specialized capabilities to deliver, as you know, some of the COVID vaccines to, in particular, isolated Indigenous communities. It had the medical capacity, it had the lift capacity to get there, it had the logistics capacity to be able to do that, and it had the capacity to keep those vaccines cool and administer them in a safe and professional manner, and also sort of look out for any sort of side effects and so forth. So that's exactly so. I think having a more careful and nuanced, discussion about what we want to do here. With the Canadian, in terms of equipment, are the Canadian Armed Forces effectively equipped for this? We can have a discussion later about the different options aside from the Canadian Armed Forces. But I think there's two issues that I think we want to keep in mind here. One is the RFAs. And one key concerns I have is that we have an increasing number of incidents where provinces file RFAs and the federal government responds to them long before provincial and local resources have been exhausted, which is the requirement not just to file that RFA, but for the federal government to respond. And so I worry on the RFA side about the politicization of the Canadian Armed Forces for the purpose of politicians, in particular federal politicians, that are responding too quickly, and that inherently sets perverse incentives. Because if you're a province or a municipality, why are you going to invest in mitigation measures? Why are you going to invest in critical infrastructure? Why are you going to invest in your own assets and capabilities if you can just pick up the phone and ask for the Canadian Armed Forces? And for instance, we've seen in Newfoundland a divestment of its own emergency measures organization, a province that's disproportionately hard hit, but for fiscal reasons and other reasons, because there's a sense that, the federal government's just going to answer the phone when we call. The other sort of this broader sort of problem that we've seen, I think, of the politicization of domestic operations. I mentioned the deployment in British Columbia, but we've also seen in other circumstances where perhaps both the length and the extent of the deployment that was ultimately sort of suggested by the political authority was not necessarily commensurate with what is required on the ground. And in some cases, there's a famous quote from colonel in Quebec from fighting forest fires, them getting deployed and saying, look, we have no equipment or training to do this, but we'll do our best. And that's what the Canadian Armed Forces do. But, we need to kind of, think about how do we better posture ourselves and calibrate ourselves, because the demands are going to get more frequent. They're going to get bigger in terms of the deployment, the number of people required, and the complexities. And on the complexities issues, and is the Canadian Armed Forces postured I mean, if you had asked any Canadian Armed Forces officer in 2019 to list sort of the 100 sort of most likely complex, difficult deployments they might have, delivering COVID vaccines was not going to be anywhere on those top 100. I think nobody at staff college or in the wargaming rooms ever sort of gamed this out. The Canadian Armed Forces sort of figured it out, and that's why we have this type of organization. But I think, are we adequately postured in this country for the complexities? And I think there are other countries that do it more sustainably and do it more cost effectively, because ultimately for the taxpayer, there's probably no more expensive deployment than calling on the Canadian Armed Forces.
No, so holistically, you've touched on a lot of different points, and I'm glad that you've mentioned a lot of the different emergency response we've done, be it BC, Newfoundland, Yellowknife, and the specialization approach the CAF brings aboard. We're going to get off the rails, definitely, because we have a lot of different topics that you've covered here in one shot, and I appreciate that, which is good because it's going to set us up well for the future discussion specific to the RFAs. I know that Dan specifically has insights and comments on this, so I'll turn to him for potentially a contrasting view, but also some agreement in some regard.
Oh, thanks for that, Alex. No, I think Christian brought up a number of really valid points. And I mean, I think he's echoed a lot of the stuff that has been said by the CDS, where when we talk about civil assistance, that Canadian Forces will always respond to requests for civil assistance, but he also noted that the force structure right now is probably too small to be able to deal with these tasks in in a manner that maybe will have the desired impact on the ground. And I mean, we've seen that. I mean, I've seen it firsthand. When we deployed to the floods in Montreal and in 2017 and in Laval in 2019, the reserves and the military, the Canadian Forces deployed with a force. But could more soldiers have been useful? Yeah, probably for the first couple of weeks, definitely. But then this also ties into sort of how those forces are employed over the course of the operation, where that first surge capacity of 2 weeks, if it's a flood or maybe if it's a forest fire, there's a lot to be said about that, having that military capacity to surge in, which was mainly reservists. There weren't a ton of Reg Force personnel, at least in that specific AO. The problem is when you get to week 3, week 4, and now you're employing soldiers to do cleanup, right? To empty sandbags and deconstruct stuff. And that's where sort of the value proposition kind of starts to fall apart for the soldier, where the crisis is over and it very much feels like cheap labor. So I think that the CAF needs to be mindful of that when deploying, whether it be Reg Force or reservists on domestic ops. Reservists in particular, because at the end of the day, if a reservist has a bad experience, and this goes back to Christian's points about the challenges with the reserves, if a reservist deploys on a flood 1 year and has a miserable experience and doesn't feel validated and having added value and just really comes away feeling like cheap labor, well, when that next flood happens, they may not volunteer. They may decide to stay home. So, but I will say, so maybe just quickly transitioning into into the value proposition of the reserves. While Christian mentioned, the volunteering piece, the high turnover piece, and the training challenges within the reserves, there's a lot of upsides. The one and many that he mentioned, being dispersed. And also having local knowledge of the terrain and the population, right? I mean, I can tell you again, personal experience working the vaccine rollout. When you're working at a vaccine station or a building or whatnot, and you're actually seeing your neighbors come in, and you're seeing people that come in because you're a member of that community. There's an incredible amount of value to the member, but also to the institution. So when we talk about recruiting, retention, how the Canadian Forces is seen by the Canadian public, that it's seen it all, right? I mean, let's not forget that we have a bad habit in this country of building bases that are very far away from any kind of built-up population. So the average Canadian, if they do see somebody in uniform, it's a reservist, because those are the people that are parading in our cities and our towns. on Remembrance Day, on the Battle of the Atlantic parades. This is where the Canadian public are seeing soldiers, not driving through Petawawa, sadly. So this is where I'll segue into what I think is sort of a really key solution space, which would be the Army Reserves. And Alex, I don't want to get too ahead of myself as far as like where you want me to stop talking and hand over to somebody else, and I can come back and talk about the reserves in a little bit more detail as far as what that could look like. I can do that now, or I can do it down the road in the conversation.
No, for to take it now, we've got quite a bit of time, and I know Shawna's going to come in and provide comments after. So this is great. Yeah, take the time you would like to. I appreciate it.
All right, Shawna, I won't be too much longer, I promise. So yeah, and I mean, granted, I'm biased. I'm a reservist, but I did start off in the Reg Force, so I have seen both sides of the coin. I've seen the strength and the weaknesses of the Reg Force and the strength and weaknesses of the reserves. And I am a firm believer that the Army Reserves, specifically, can have an enormous amount of potential in deploying on domestic operations. But again, we have to think about how we see the reserves and how the reserves is managed in the Canadian Forces, and how that's fundamentally different from how reserve forces are managed in most other of our allied countries. I think we're one of the only countries in the world among our allies where we have a reserve force that is smaller than our Reg Force. And that's counterintuitive. The Reg Force should be much larger than the regular force. Like, that's point number one. But and if that was the case, imagine a military of 100,000 reservists. It would certainly, now you're able to have a far greater impact. But we don't have that mindset in the Canadian Forces. Now, do I think that the Canadian public has an appetite for a reserve force that large? I do. I think for a number of reasons, because the value proposition is very strong. A reservist costs a fraction of what a Reg Force soldier costs. You don't have to, you're not paying for medical and dental, you're paying for them when they work. For this cost of one Reg Force major, you can have 5 reserve majors. And I think that's a pretty good return on investment. And number two, reserve units, because they're dispersed, you end up getting a lot more traction when you look at a reserve deployment in a domestic context. I can tell you that while I deployed twice as a regular force officer on expeditionary ops, I did one overseas operation as a reservist. It took me 2 years to coordinate with my employer at the time to get that 6 months off and make sure everything was lined up and that there was a tour in place. So it was complicated on both sides, on the Army side to actually get the tour lined up, and on the employer side to get everything lined up to make sure that things would be all right when I was away. It took me 10 minutes to get approval for a domestic op from my boss, because my boss was one borough away from somewhere where some of the worst floods were happening. So that motivated him to say, yeah, my neighbors are flooded. Get out there, do something, take the time you need, come back when it's done. Because it's local and you're having a local impact. And in many cases, even some of my colleagues, their homes were flooded. And I saw them when I was on the deployment, sandbagging their own houses. And they appreciated, seeing me, seeing my colleagues, seeing other civilian soldiers or citizen soldiers from their communities deployed and helping them out. And that's really, you talk about messaging when it comes to the value proposition of the Canadian Forces to the Canadian public. That's enormous, right? So, all that to say, I think it comes back to investment, where the Canadian Forces can be anything that Canada wants it to be, if it's ready and willing to invest the time and resources in doing so. And this is where I'll harken back to the reserves because Christian brought up a really good point about equipment not being optimized for domestic ops. For the Reg Force, definitely. What are you going to do with a LAV-3, right? This thing chews up gas like nobody's business to drive down René Lévesque Boulevard in Montreal? Like, no. But if you have a reserve vehicle, which is not an LS, a LAV, but probably an LSVW or a G-Wagon or some light vehicle, which is what the reserves have, because reserve units are all fundamentally light units. Doesn't cost as much, far more versatile, narrower wheelbase to be able to operate in an urban area. Heavy equipment, not military armored heavy equipment that you'll find at 5RGC or 2CER, but basically civilian heavy equipment painted green that you can use. And all those operators, you don't even need the equipment. You can use municipal equipment because they're trained on how to use that as well. So there's a lot of versatility. And then we're not even talking about the civilian skills that each of these reservists bring to the table with respect to carpenters, plumbers, welders, people that work as municipal engineers in municipalities, and do all sorts of other elements that can be brought to bear in the context of a domestic op. If we had the structures and systems to be able to properly leverage that in the Canadian Forces and really, really value what reservists can do and value the impacts that domestic operations have strategically on how we're seen, how the Canadian Forces is seen by the Canadian people. And I think that's really undervalued, especially with a military that tends to have the bad habit of narrowing its field of view to really look at the immediate operational output as opposed to the long-term strategic goals and second and third order positive impacts of investing in certain kinds of activities like domestic operations. So I'll end it there, but that's sort of my thoughts on the reserves in the context of domestic ops and why I think they would be a very good tool to continue to leverage and maybe leverage even further in the context of having impact on the ground for these types of crises. Thank you.
Well, of course, and some great insight there, specifically when you speak to, the lab basis and just the platforms and the equipment as an example, right? So having deployed in 2019 down from Petawawa to Ottawa for the floods, bringing labs down and stuff, we quickly found there was issues just with like antennas getting caught on streetlights and whatnot, and looking at these different considerations, or even just like chewing up local roads as we're going through to move to different areas. There's definitely versatility, and there's the idea of presence, which we wanted to have when we came down with labs, which was very important for us at the time. But when we kind of look at the other hand, like having the different implications of the civilian resources available, this is something we have to have a consideration. And potentially one of the solutions is looking at having this registry available. Because as you mentioned too, the faraway bases were coming down from Petawawa, be it Edmonton's a little different, and even Valcartier is a little different, but specific also to Gagetown. When we're going out to these areas, the reservists are the ones that are in the communities that understand the basis. And this is one of the reasons volunteer fire departments, as an example, are best applied in composite companies with regular force firefighters, because they have the pre-plans, right? They understand what the communities they're doing the volunteering in is and what the realities of those communities are in terms of the connections and the complex web. So Shawna, I'll turn to you for some comments and some insights on this, because I'm sure from a crisis communication standpoint, but also just based on personal experience, you have some valuable insight to add.
Well, I had these great notes all formatted, and then I have these scrolled comments based on my colleagues Christian and Dan's things that I want to also sort of endorse a little bit and that I agree with. So first of all, let's talk about Christian's thoughts about the politicization that we're seeing of deploying the military in for domestic operations. 100%, you're absolutely right. If there's 100 helicopters lined up and one is a military helicopter, the media are supporting that politicization because they're the ones that are filming that's the one you're seeing in all the reels and all the news feeds. And I would say to you that a little bit of that happened in Yellowknife, because respectfully sharing this, I was sitting in a campground in early August watching that smoke come in, wondering, we haven't heard anything about what's happening here for an evacuation. We were there on holiday. We were visiting our daughter, and I went to the website. So I'm probably talking the August the 8th or 9th, and the only information on the City of Yellowknife website, and I'm not throwing anyone under the bus here, it's an observation, was a fire ban from June 25th. And we'd already had a lot of information in the media about a lack of a plan for evacuation, and that we had this framework in place, right? We'd already seen Betchico cut off the roadway between Fort Providence and Yellowknife. So we were actually at a point, I feel, where we got as many people out as we could, or they got as many people out as they could by vehicle. But airlift was the last resort, because it was waited for so long for that evacuation to commence, right? The memes out there, the fire's 12 kilometers away, let's all evacuate. Oh wait, the fire's 12 kilometers away still, let's all return home and re-enter. But my point in that is that I do think there was a level of politicization there with that, because that is all you saw in the feeds, was that airlift getting people the most vulnerable out of hospitals, and that out of Yellowknife at the time. So great point on that. And Dan, I agree 100% what you're saying about the reserves, because The reserves are members of our local communities, and we don't even have this. I'm talking 20 years ago. I used to say the reserves don't have a problem with diversity and inclusion because they are exactly a reflection of the demographic of that region and that area. Unlike the CAF, where we've struggled with that a bit, we never have that with the reserves, right? So I agree. Who better to put into deployment where you're speaking the same language, where you know your neighbors, where someone you go to school with is helping you. So all of that to say, I agree with all of those points, both those points. But I'm going to be I'm going to put some fly in the ointment here, because when I talked about just instilling this sense of confidence that comes, in environments marked by this confusion and uncertainty, the military does bring a sense of hope with them, rightly or wrongly. For whatever they can do, just their presence brings a sense of hope. But I think it's really essential that we go back to remember that the Canadian Armed Forces is fundamentally a tool of foreign policy, responsible for responding to national and global crises, and diverting their focus to roles such as firefighting or flood preparedness. It diminishes their readiness to fulfill their primary mission. Now, since OCA, this has been further exacerbated, right? Because CAF readiness was almost always paid for before by the federal government. And then in OCA, we saw that, or by the province, pardon me. And then we saw this switch. And now we're seeing that they are the first call and not a last call of action. So if we say a deployment, for example, costs maybe, I don't know, I'm just throwing out a number, say it's $500 million to deploy the military. That is coming directly out of an operational maintenance budget for D&D. And that erodes operational readiness. We have less money to spend on food, fuel, ammunition, training, whatever it may be. And we must always, I think, remain mindful that the military and their core mandate, as outlined in our defense policy, that strong, secure, and engaged, is to ensure that our military does stay ready, resilient, and capable. Because in this increasingly uncertain global landscape that we're seeing, and today we are unstable, and Canada needs a force that is ready for whatever they're called upon to do to defend Canada, its primary mission. So the CAF cannot be replaced in that primary mission, that role. Nobody else is trained to do that type of work on behalf of defending Canada. But I do think that what we can do is develop a resource and response capability outside of the Canadian Forces to support these disaster responses. We do need the CAF to be a last resort and not a first resort. And although I agree with Dan is saying on so many levels, from a reserve capacity and what we see in the US from a National Guard perspective, my challenge is that right now, because of the deficiency in our numbers and recruitment, we are seeing 20 to 30% of our deployments require reservists to fulfill our missions. So if we're taking the reserves to do domestic operations, we're not going to be able to fulfill that primary role that is still the primary role for the reserve soldiers. Just in Afghanistan alone, we saw over 4,600 deployments of reserve soldiers to fulfill our mandate for Canada. And 16 of those lost their lives in combat missions. So I just feel that sometimes Canadians look at us in domestic operational scenarios and this is all they see. But the reality is, when we are in a space right now of instability across the globe, we need our military to be ready to defend Canada. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Shawna, these are some great points, and I'm glad you mentioned SSC as well as our North Strong and Free, because they're going to definitely have considerations for the future volatility, because obviously we've got domestic considerations for volatility in terms of aggravating with climate security for the incidents, and they're longer, the fire seasons are definitely longer, but also outside of that, outside of Canada, we've got considerations too, right? So when we consider, for example, Christian mentioned BC having people deployed half a year to BC for fires, then Alberta, be it whatnot, you have to ask, how does this affect the managed readiness plan, right? Especially when we consider we're surging Latvia from a battle group to a full brigade, and that's going to take obviously troops. It's not just headquarters we can send over, as well as equipment and resources and funding. And as you've mentioned, there's definitely those considerations in terms of the economic strain, but also the strain it actually just puts on the people within the CAF as well. Just coming into some comments from the Q&A, because I think they're really relevant here. Tim Kenny does mention from Team Rubicon that there's obstacles that are multidimensional with the humanitarian workforce program that was established in 2022 specific to Public Safety Canada's responses, right? So a bunch of different organizations essentially coming together to provide volunteer basis to support these emergencies that's meant to help alleviate the burden on the CAF. But again, these HWP responses are tied to requests for assistance or RFAs, similar to the CAF, and they're time bound. So what happens when the need to be conditions-based transition does happen to recovery ops? It's a question we have to assume in terms when we consider things like business continuity, which we actually touched upon with community resilience on a previous webinar as part of this Minds program for this project. Definitely another piece here is the idea that we have to have more engagement between the federal government and the provincial governments and territorial governments, evidently, because them alone, they don't make the decisions in this regard. There's also the private sector that has to be considered, as well as what implications they have, both in preparedness and education and awareness within the communities, but also in terms of recovery after the fact, right? So we're seeing in Jasper right now, that's quite a reality. And as Jasper begins to kind of fade out of the regulatory news cycle, like the 24-hour piece here, in favor of other pieces, we have to consider, like, is Jasper still going to be remembered? What's going to be happening in terms of like the actual build back up? And we're not even considering things like, Fort McMurray, which isn't fully back on its feet, or Lytton, just as two examples among a plethora of other ones that exist. So turning here a little bit, the discussion, and implementations and solutions basis, because that's what I want this webinar to really be about, is discussing solutions. I'm going to ask Christian for his insight on any strategies that can be implemented to improve the CAF's ability to respond effectively to RFAs, and perhaps even better the awareness of provinces and territories to the specialized equipment that's available. Are we looking at things like liaison officers? Do we have to have better registries in terms of what's going on in the communities? And then from there, from Christian, I'm going to turn to Dan and Shawna, of course, for some more comments there.
So Shawna, Dan, fantastic comments. I'm a cyclist. I go biking most mornings, and the reason I can do long distances is because I get to bike behind really talented, capable people, and I draft behind them, and it saves 30% of my energy. So that's what I just felt from your comments here. I can draft behind your terrific on-the-ground observations. So thanks for that. And let me pick up on some of those, right? So the federal government, of course, has the opportunity for cost recovery from provinces, but in most cases, the federal government doesn't exercise that because the politics of it, you send a bill to a province or a community that's just been hard hit, is probably not going to look particularly good. So, and provinces, of course, know that much of the cost is probably going to get absorbed by the federal government. The point that Shawna made about readiness, right? So the Canadian Armed Forces has 8 mandates, 2 of which are not resourced, and domestic operations is one of those 2 mandates. So anytime we have a domestic operation, the resources have to come from somewhere else and being pulled off. So you're either going to go for the reservists, or you're going to end up having to pull people out of training, out of the rest period, or off a mission that they're on. And that's an interesting observation in the sense that the previous Chief of Defense Staff, and I suspect the current Chief of Defense Staff, has insisted that the biggest challenge for the organization is the sustainment and force generation piece. Because we've spent 25 years focusing on operations. And so the readiness piece, if you can't sustain and generate your force, you're not going to be able to have a force that is ready. So if we're constantly pulling people off and we're constantly pulling equipment off, it means we're not going to be able to achieve that fundamental objective of sustainment. And I thought Shawna made a great observation about the private sector. It's something that we haven't done particularly well. So Canadian Blood Services, during the pandemic, offered that they could help with the vaccine distribution because guess what? They have cooling facilities. They know how to move stuff across the country. They have a large logistics operation. They can get it out to a whole set of communities, including places that are fairly far off in the periphery. Well, that offer wasn't taken up because the easy button was, well, the Canadian Armed Forces can do it, so let's just have the CAF do it, and then we'll figure out with some other private operators what they can add. So we haven't been very creative about thinking about, I think in a democracy, the challenge is always that ultimately we want a liberal democracy is premised on limited state intervention. And when you call out the armed forces, that's a pretty big sledgehammer in any circumstances to pull out. And there are circumstances, absolutely, where citizens and taxpayers expect, and just the psychological effect that Shawna mentioned, and then the operational effect that Dan mentioned. But in practice, it also means it's a significant, sizable form of state intervention, which of course then is the question of, is this really how we want to be using our Canadian Armed Forces? Not just in terms of the resourcing, but in terms of, as a democracy, is this the way we want the state to intervene? Or are there actually more efficient, more effective mechanisms that will provide a more adequate delivery? There's also interesting questions about then how we deploy the resources when they're on the ground. I'd love to hear Shawna's and Dan's comments on this. So we have a great study going back to the Red River floods, and we looked at where the Sand River dikes broke and where they didn't break. Well, guess what? The places they broke were all places that were built by civilians. The places that didn't break were all places that were built by military. Why? Well, because if you tell a soldier under the direction of an officer, you place that sandbag here and you run that tarp through here, they will do exactly as they're told. They're not just going to chug that sandbag on top there. And so you can build, from an engineering perspective, a pretty darn perfect dike. Now, but on the civilian side, as you've often seen sort of in footage, you know, civilians will fill the sandbag, they'll chug it on, eventually they'll run the tarp through. In many cases, they'll do it very well if they've been trained well. In other places, you just get community volunteers and you chug them on. So what's the optimal use of the Canadian Armed Forces? You have a soldier standing there making sure that you direct civilians to pack those sandbags and place those sandbags optimally. Well, can you imagine the optics on the nightly news of the soldier standing there and telling the civilians how to bag and place those sandbags, right? So there's an interesting sort of optimization aspect when we have these RFAs about, can we actually provide, you know, what is within the realm of the possible in terms of the scarce resources we have, how do we use them for most optimal effect? And I think Dan pointed out, well, there's 3 types of labor when we have RFAs that we use the Canadian Armed Forces for. The most common use is simply surge capacity for general labor. We just need people and we need them quickly. And that's what most of the RFAs are. They're fairly short duration, usually 2 weeks or less. They're surge capacity. We can bring in the locals. They can work on the local civilian direction. But there's 2 other types of labor. One is lift capacity. And usually, I mean, we live in a big country where it can be very difficult to move things around, especially on a quick basis. You know, think about the Lower Mainland when you have these atmospheric weather events, or for instance, or so forth. The Canadian Armed Forces can provide that lift capacity on a short notice. Can be very difficult to get in other ways. Or think of Yellowknife and the like. But interesting comments by Shawna on how that military and lift capacity was perhaps used, and with more planning could have been used with perhaps better runway in a way that would have put less of a burden on the armed forces. And the third is expertise, in particular engineering expertise. And of course, this is sort of what Dan sort of can talk to. And on all 3 of those, of course, I would say the lift capacity piece is probably not one that we're ever going to find a ready way to replace rapidly with the private sector. So the Air Force in domestic operations is always going to play an important component. But I wonder whether, for instance, on the Army side, on the general surge capacity side, whether a model that most European countries have, the Technische Hilfswerk in Germany, state emergency services in Australia, large volunteer organizations that are trained up, that you can even move in Australia across state lines. And those organizations then also provide a lot of very specialized technical expertise, plus they come with technical equipment that you can deploy where you don't need to use resources. And Dan's sort of point about the folks in the reserves, they cannot just drive a G-Wagon, they can also drive your civilian equipment, because it's relatively easy to cross-train people on that type of equipment. You know, the question here is that perhaps as an area where we could do better and coordinate more effectively and more efficiently. I think enough from me for now.
Oh, it's good. Thank you, because you're really speaking about the pieces that come to the crux of the issue. Specifically, when we talk about the specialized capabilities, I hear lift coming back as one that's really important to consider, especially in terms of what the CAF can provide, but also when we have it being applied like domestically, how it affects the ability to use it expeditionarily on a basis, sending it over to Latvia or wherever else we decide to commit ourselves in the future. And then we have to ask ourselves the question, like the more we employ the CAF domestically, does it affect our insight and really our our plans to send us over at an expeditionary basis, like outside of the country? Should we be considering that we have to keep Reg Force members back for the for RFAs that are evolving? And should that be a consideration we take into play when we consider what missions we're going to send people out? When we consider that the Army turned down Afghanistan in 2021 as an example, just based on its commitments it had, like concurrently with everything going on, it's something definitely that we have to look at. And I think we're getting to the crux of the issue in the discussion today. I'll turn to Dan here for more comments on the RFAs and really his points to follow up from Christian, and then to Shawna. Dan, please.
Yeah, I'll go back one sec because there was a great point that Shawna had brought up about diversity in the reserves, and I want to circle back on that and echo that point and how important that is in the context of the reserves, where the reserves really is a reflection of the society in which they live. Because coming from Montreal, having commanded 34 Combat Engineer Regiment, which has a unit in Montreal and another unit in Rouyn-Noranda. The Montreal component of that was an incredibly diverse, multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-everything. Lots of new Canadians, children of new Canadians, and it's their first exposure to the military, right? You're kind of dipping your toe in the water of this institution through the reserves. And one of the things that was a huge strength for us, and it's a series of anecdotal stories, I'll just give you one, is that when we deployed to the elderly care homes, it was our young sappers that were going into these homes, and I shouldn't say sappers, young soldiers, because it's not just the engineers. We were deploying to those homes, and it was guys, soldiers from the Régiment de la Maisonneuve, the Royal Montreal Regiment, the Black Watch, the Fusiliers de Montréal, all these guys, and all diverse. And going into elderly care homes in Montreal, where you had people that were sadly dying, but in many cases couldn't speak English or French because they were Italian, they were Greek, they were Portuguese, they were Egyptian. And it was our soldiers, and it's a bit of it's an emotional story, is that we had soldiers that sat with elderly people as they were dying, but able to speak to them in Italian in their last days and their last moments, because their family couldn't even come into the elderly care home. So if you want to talk about transformational impact that reserve soldiers, citizen soldiers can have on the ground, I don't think it can be any more profound than that. To be able to be, and it was difficult for our soldiers because they became attached to these individuals, right? So, really traumatic, difficult for a lot of our young men and women during that time, but the impact was momentous. And the other point, which I thought was a really good point from Dr. Leuprecht, where you were talking about having the soldiers training the civilians on how to do the sandbag walls and all that. Well, the challenge there, and this is where I will put my engineer hat on, is when we deployed in 2017 and 2019, we used that model, but for the infantry. So what would happen is you would have engineers, sergeants, and warrants, and captains that were, in most cases, degreed engineers that were engineers and project managers in their day job. They became either members of the Engineer Support and Coordination Cell or the recce detachments that would go and do reconnaissance on these various sites that were flooded. Following that, they would bring with them a corporal and a sapper, or a master corporal and a sapper, or a master corporal and a corporal, two young people that were, had their qualifications as an engineer. They would show them the site, and then they were the ones that were essentially the site supervisors and site foremen for the infantry platoons that would show up on site. Because sadly, unless you're a trained engineer and understand the fundamentals of how to build, the infantry is not trained on how to do that. And you ended up very much, Christian, with your big pile of sandbags that you indicated. And these were the sites that we would come upon often if the engineers got there too late. and a platoon of infantry had a few hours to do their level best on a site to try and block the water. So I think that the idea is good, but this goes back to the strategic issue of then, if this is a role that the CAF decides should be oriented towards the reserves, then at that point we need to look at the force structure of the reserves and say, well, you know, in 34 Brigade, do we really need 14 infantry units and 1 engineer unit and 1 pioneer platoon that's in one of the infantry units? Or maybe we actually need 2 engineer regiments and we need a pioneer regiment, not just a platoon. Maybe we need more of those technical capacities to be able to be a real force enabler on the ground. Because if, you know, at the end of the day, any of these units will still be able to do, they'll call it staff augmentation to expeditionary ops. So, the day Alex deploys as a squadron commander to Latvia and needs to fill 20 spots in his squadron, he will still have the onesies and twosies from 34 combat engineer, 35 combat engineer, 9e Génie that will be able to come and augment his force. But, you know, you'll always have that no matter what the force structure looks like. But in the context of a domestic op, you know, and it's a cliche to say this, but it really, really echoes true in the context of a domestic op, there are never enough engineers. And this is where it really, really is true. When I was deploying 19-year-old sappers to tell, you know, a Black Watch sergeant how to build a dike. So, you know, so there's a risk that you're taking as a leader there, where you're just really hoping that 19-year-old sapper is switched on enough to be able to keep that site in one piece. And if he or she is having difficulty being able to call the sergeant that's driving around in a Milcott trying to, you know, do, you know, site supervision for 5 different sites and driving back and forth and talking to 5 19-year-old sappers and corporals who are trying to herd the cats that are the Black Watch or whatever and trying to build a site. And the last point I'll say is, for anybody on this call that is interested in learning about the reserves, you know, there's a gentleman by the name of CP Champion who wrote an outstanding book called Relentless Struggle. And if you are interested in getting an understanding of the reserves from its inception until essentially 2019, 2020, the end of our time in Afghanistan, it is a fantastic read, and it'll give you some real insight into the reserves, which is critical because I think Christian alluded to it, that one of the big challenges within the Canadian Forces is understanding the reserves, understanding where they are best employed, where they should not be employed, and where to invest, and in order to grow and create a meaningful value proposition to Canadians to encourage them to join the reserves. And that, you know, and all the other things that the reserves bring to the table, which is to say, you know, whether it be component transfers to the Reg Force, supporting the Reg Force through that, full-time reservists that backfill vacant Reg Force positions in National Defense Headquarters, not to mention, you know, augmenting deployments, supporting domestic ops, supporting recruiting. For anybody that goes to Parliament Hill and sees the changing of the guard, those are reservists. There is not a Reg Force person there, right? Like these are the things that our citizen soldiers do. So a lot to be said there. So that's I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there for now, Alex, and pass it on to Shawna maybe.
No worries. Actually, yeah, some insight there. So 2 points I want to bring up, because one, you talk about the transformational impact, which I'm going to come back to in a minute, because we're going to pivot to social media a little bit, because I know Shawna has some great points on that. But specifically, you mentioned, you know, like the sandbagging piece in the infantry. So I remember in 2019 deploying, we actually had a video that was published by the Canadian Army Public Affairs. It was made by a couple of NCOs from 2CR on how to actually build a sandbag, because we were seeing sandbags being built and not properly employed. And that was an interesting piece, because then it got a lot of traction, you know. And even just popping up on the YouTube video I have right here, I can see that it had more than like 10,000 views. I'm going to post a link to a second video of that was published in the Q&A here in a minute on Michael's comment about our panel being fascinating and educational, so it's appreciated. But the comment you made about the reserve specifically, I want to come back to it because it reminded me of a specific passage in David Bercusson's Fighting Canadians, which is really a comprehensive overview of Canadian Army commitments from pre-Confederation times to really post-Afghanistan. And on page 304 specifically, it notes that in 1996, the Special Commission on Restructuring of the Reserves recommended that the Army Reserve units in Canada be reorganized into brigades and that they'd be allowed to send formed units, platoons, troops, even companies on active operations. But to date, reservists, who now usually constitute some 20% of every deployment expeditionarily, continue their service abroad as individuals augmenting regular force units. And as you mentioned, I think part of that discussion of what it comes down to in terms of restructuring, be it having the discussion of like, should we have 19 infantry units or restructure to pioneers or engineers, does come back to regimental affiliation, which Bercusson specifically addresses in depth, right? Because like it's that regimental affiliation and the idea of the honorary colonels and everything that kind of like form the basis for the reserves that does create some political friction in terms of the PRES, in terms of making sustainable change, be it from an infantry unit turning into some engineers or armored or whatever it might be. So just an example on that. But we're going to pivot a little bit here to social media and that transformational impact and the idea of the soldier citizens. And I know Shawna is going to share some really good insights on that, as well as to follow up on yours and Christian's points.
Well, just thank you both for Dan and Dr. Leuprecht for what you shared there. And I agree with Christian that there's always going to be a role for the CAF in our domestic operations for disasters, whether it be airlift requirements in our northern communities or portable water treatment facilities where they're needed. I think the big question to me is, how do we replace the masses of soldiers or the folks that are brought out? So in other words, how do we replace the number of people that it takes to create a fire break to make a difference in a community, that type of thing? And that goes back to, in some ways, that believing that the climate crisis is only getting worse, right? We're seeing more natural hazards, we're seeing more impacts more frequently, more destructive, more costly, all of the above. And I think there's a conversation in there that we need to be having with some of the groups that we're seeing up front and center right now. Like I'm just going to use Jasper because it's close to me here in Alberta, and we're seeing the Red Crosses in there providing, community assistance and all of that re-entry work being done by them. We're seeing Team Rubicon in there doing excellent work, going through the community, salvaging, showing, making sure the public stays safe by being the ones in there to help in the proper PPE, doing the work that's needed to get people to re-enter their homes. So and then probably, in BC, we saw a lot of the Salvation Army. So we do have these groups, unlike what was happening with the conversation about Canadian Blood Services, that are out there doing good things. What I don't know as an average Joe, and I'll be honest, I don't know this. I don't know if we understand their true limitations, their true capacities, their strengths, where they have weaknesses, and how we can more collaboratively work together to go into communities. I know that we're always very careful on that private element too, not taking away work from the private sector, that type of thing. So where does that balance and that shift come in? So I think at some point we have to have hard conversations about how do we replace the masses of hands on the task that needs to get done when we're going in from a recovery space there. And when we see our soldiers and other military members, and I always revert to soldiers, but anyone in the CAF who's in there doing the job, we often do see them profiled in media because oftentimes a public affairs person is deployed with them. And they're out there, their primary job is to get media attention, to show the good work that's being done on that domestic operation, and to raise sort of that PR profile for the CAF. You don't always see that with other organizations, or it can be hit and miss, but the military is always there and ready to provide a soldier to do an interview in French or English. So we kind of go in with our marching orders ourselves as public affairs folks, or at least I did, on what my job was. And that was to profile the good work that was being done in this community to support this crisis or this disaster. But what worries me from when I look back on it now is what is the image and brand of the CAF today? If we need to strike a balance, I feel, in the national public narrative as we promote through social media and other media, traditional media, if we overemphasize the Canadian Armed Forces as saviors in domestic crises, we risk undermining public understanding of their primary role, where a distinct set of skill sets, training, and focus is absolutely required for the defense of Canada. And I know I keep going back to this, but the CAF does not exist in isolation. And that public narrative that we promote and what we do, we need the support of the broader Canadian public to manage what we do. If the perception of the average Canadian is all that we do is fight wildfires or do sandbagging and floods, it's going to be really hard, I think, to convince Canadians that we need to spend money on a new warship or a new airplane. You know, if you think about the Canadian Armed Forces today, we do not have anti-tank weapon systems, anti-aircraft weapon systems, and we're 10 years past prime on our supply ships for the Navy. Some could argue against me on this, but we sent our military into Afghanistan without all the proper equipment that they needed. And it costs lives. It costs lives of Canadian soldiers. So we can talk and blame the government procurement system, but I don't know. I feel that we have more of a cultural identity problem there. We're sitting back here watching what's happening on the war in the Ukraine from the comfort of our offices and our living rooms right now. We're seeing all the conflicts in the South and East China Seas. We saw what happened with Israel and Gaza over the weekend. And I don't know, maybe there's those that think the US are going to protect us. I don't know. I don't want to go down that road today. But we're a country that needs to be prepared to defend our own sovereignty. And I don't know if the public will see the urgency or the necessity to equip an Army, Air Force, or Navy with weapons that allow Canadian soldiers and military and airmen to do this, and naval personnel, because right now they see a military deploying in support of wildfires, floods, and hurricanes. And to counter this, we need dual messaging. I think we need a dual messaging strategy. We should absolutely communicate what is happening on the ground for these domestic ops, but we also need to be very careful that we are also ensuring that that the messaging that's getting out about what their primary role is, that the training cycle, that what's happening there is all front and center as well. When we look at the narrative in scholarly circles and media of late, you know, we see that the CAF is the easy button, right? It's the easy button that we push, and costing less to employ than the provinces and territories can manage, and instead of building their own capabilities internally. But when I look at this from a public narrative perspective, we had public support for Afghanistan, and we all talked about how quickly we were going to lose that after that mission ended. And now we're seeing this shift. So I guess I'm just throwing that out there. I don't have the answers to it, but my concern is if we don't have a dual narrative and we don't focus on the primary role of the CAF in the eyes of the Canadian public, we won't have support from them when we may need them down the road. And I think that road is getting closer to us than any of us ever imagined it would in our lifetime. I'm going to leave that there.
No, it's good. Firmly agree on that. And there's definitely some something to be said about the image. And you know, obviously there's the social media campaigns for things like the multinational brigade now in Latvia and what it gets in terms of its posturing, you know, for defense and deterrence in the eastern flank. And I know you've definitely mentioned some pieces that are outside of the scope of the webinar today in terms of what's going on, you know, in South China Sea and in the different areas of the world and what the CAF commitments for that look like. But specifically, like as we're mentioning, it's good to at least take note and then have that duality of conflicting interests, right? Of us deploying expeditionarily to support whatever it might be as foreign policy, as you know, war still being an extension of politics from Clausewitz, because I get to put that little ad in there as a research fellow from my PD. But also at the same time, like we are using them for domestic considerations and the growing need for the ops, especially when we don't have the people available in the different provinces for an aggravating and growing need through climate security, disaster response, and what it might be. Turning over to you, Christina, do you have any thoughts on that, and maybe what regulatory and legal frameworks we might have to deal with moving forward as well to kind of like move forward with the solution for the reserves and what the RFAs mean moving forward for Canada and the CAF?
So it's a great observation on a whole host of fronts. So one is, of course, one of the reasons why the federal government likes using the armed forces is because it owns all the liability. So there's interesting legal conversations around the moment you start to deploy with local resources, private sector resources, and so forth, the JAGs and the lawyers all of a sudden get really nervous about sort of who owns the liability. So there is also, in defense of the federal government, there's sort of an efficiency argument to be made. But you know, other countries have solved this particular problem. So I think, you know, we've got enough smart JAGs and smart lawyers around that I think we can crack that nut. On the regulatory sort of and legal side, I mean, Why did we end up in 45 CHSLDs and 9 old age care homes in Ontario? Well, because these were ill-managed, ill-effectively supervised, ill-managed. So basically, the federal government, the Canadian Armed Forces, had to backstop under regulation and improper auditing, supervision, and so forth of the way old age care homes are run, are staffed, and so forth. Because by and large, the military was not performing medical, they were performing some medical tasks, but by and large, the military was performing basic management tasks, basic logistic tasks that, with proper responsibility taken on by the provinces, we should have never been in that situation. And you'll know this because if you notice, there's not just the final report on the deployment to the old age care homes. There was a very unusual, a highly unusual interim report because of the relatively disturbing nature of the management and leadership circumstances in which the armed forces found themselves in those situations. Picking up on two really important points that Shawna made. One is the US and allies. I think until now, there had always been this assumption that if we get ourselves in trouble domestically, the Americans, or maybe even some other allies, NATO allies, maybe even a place like Mexico, right? A Mexican military deals with natural disasters all the time, has huge expertise, would be there to help us out. Well, it turns out that our allies, and in particular the United States, are fully tapped out. So it's not like they have people or equipment around to help us out. And that's a significant game changer from 20 years ago. That even if we wanted to call Washington or our allies, there is no one to call, because if you're going to pick up the phone, they're going to tell you, we're sorry, you're going to have to look after your own sovereignty and your own people with your own equipment. And I think as Canadians, we haven't quite sort of postured ourselves for that in terms of when we think of national interest. It's not just the force projection piece that the Canadian Armed Forces and Expeditionary Organization brings. We are now in a national interest conversation where the only way to assert that interest is by ourselves because there is no one else to call. The other piece of that is the equipment procurement. That was also a really useful, I think, point to make. Politicians, it's relatively easy to convince them to buy stuff that you can use for domestic operations or deployed abroad for humanitarian and disaster relief, because they love seeing the Canadian Forces helicopter showing up with relief supplies and people and so forth. But it's relatively difficult to convince politicians to buy things. So frigates are sort of, I guess, a dual-use technology, if you want, in that regard. But F-35s, they're not all that useful for domestic operations or for humanitarian disaster relief. But of course, if you want to have a full spectrum fighting force, you're going to have to make those difficult decisions and investments in submarines, in fighter jets, and the like, that don't have this domestic sort of application. And so I think one of the concerns is that perhaps implicitly the focus on domestic operations might be distracting us from what it means to have a full spectrum force. And that then opens up a whole conversation about, should Canada have a full spectrum force? Do we actually have the resources and the capabilities? Do we just want to have effectively a very small, high capable fighting force that we call the special ops? And that by and large, the rest of the Canadian Armed Forces provide these broader supports and logistics, and maybe they can do a little bit of deterrence in Latvia, but not really, because we don't have air defense and we don't have other capabilities that we might need if we really wanted to act as deterrents. So there's a broader public conversation, I think, about what is it that we want the Canadian Armed Forces to be. And of course, Alexander brought up Clausewitz and the Clausewitzian triangle. The debate here is what the government, what citizens, and what the armed forces want the armed forces to be are three very different things. The armed forces think of themselves as a fighting organization that can do all this other stuff. If we can do the fighting piece, we can do the domestic ops and so forth. I think politicians want primarily and see the Canadian Armed Forces first and foremost as an instrument of foreign policy and a way to assert Canadian interests in an expeditionary capacity abroad. But increasingly, I think they've realized that there's domestic payoffs to be had from that organization. And citizens see it as like, well, this organization should be there basically to help me and to help others around the world when we run into trouble and, there's big disasters and so forth. This has real implications for how you posture the force, how you equip the force, how you train the force. What does readiness mean? And there's one, I think, military in the world that can do all of these among our allies and partners, which is the United States. The problem is, as Canada, we don't have enough resources. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough money. We don't have enough equipment to be able to do all of these. And so politicians try to muddle through, and we try to have the Canadian Armed Forces be sort of the jack of all trades and the master of none. And that's increasingly wearing thin, because increasingly we're becoming more and more the master of none, and ever fewer jack of at least some trades. Because I think we're not having an honest and open conversations with Canadians about what do we want the Canadian Armed Forces to be. And I think this is a very important component of this broader conversation, because how do we reconcile the expectations of the public, the expectations of the government, and what the military is able and willing to provide in terms of civil military relations in this country. And this is partially, to me, a failure of political leadership, because we live in a democracy where the political authority ultimately needs to have that conversation and needs to make those hard decisions. And as we've seen, 20 years of governments that on both sides of the political aisle want to eschew these hard types of decisions, and we just kind of try to kind of work our way through. And I think that is not working for us. And what that's going to result in is exactly, I think, what Shawna laid out, and what we also get some of the comments from Dan. We're going to have an organization that is going to start to fall short or fail in some of the missions with which it is being tasked by politicians. Because all of a sudden, we are not going to have the capacity and capability to respond, either in the way that the government wants or in the way that the public expects. And I think this is the messaging we're getting, at least from the previous CDS, that we are at a breaking point in this organization. And this breaking point is not the making of the military. This breaking point is the making of politicians who will not live up to their responsibility in a democratic society to make difficult decisions about the kind of armed forces they want to have, for what purpose they want to have them, and how they're going to do basically proper business planning. That is to say, what are the ends, what are the ways, and what means do we need in order to be able to align those three?
Well, thank you so much for the commentary on that, Chris. I especially appreciate the discussion regarding the ends, ways, and means, because that's a big piece, obviously, of the realism discussions we've had, and I'm always happy to mention Clausewitz in this context. I'm going to pivot to Dan now for his points, and I see he also wants to address something from Tim Kenny from Team Rubicon within the chat. He'll provide some remarks, and then it'll be up to Shawna for some closing remarks before we end our panel here today. So Dan, over to you.
Yeah. I like Tim's question. I think it goes back to a statement that Christian mentioned, where there's not enough people. We'll say that there's a finite number of people, and a finite number of time that each of those people have to give to something other than whatever it is they're doing to pay their mortgage or their rent. And I think this harkens back to, like, when we look at society in general. If you go back to the 1950s, and everybody can remember watching Happy Days in syndication, or if you're a little older, maybe the Andy Griffith Show, where you could fundamentally have one parent working full time, and that one parent was able to support multiple children, a household, and whatnot on that one income. That is inconceivable today. But what the knock-on effect is, and this is where a lot of volunteer organizations, whether it be St. John Ambulance, Red Cross, the Legion, the Freemasons, you name it, all these organizations are strapped for people. Not because people are less kind than they were 70 years ago. They have less disposable time because they're working longer hours. There's just less time for people to devote to these organizations. And this applies to NGOs. You know, Team Rubicon is an interesting anomaly because they do have retired veterans that maybe are in a position and have the financial stability and security to be able to give time. But I can tell you, when I was with the St. John Ambulance board in Quebec, we always talked about volunteers, how we were always short of volunteers, and a lot of our volunteers were retired, were 65 and up, and then that's when people were volunteering. So, like, this goes back to the fundamental HR challenge that we need to, I think, at the core of this. Like, all the stuff that Christiane said is absolutely valid regarding political will, engagement, promises made, not kept. But also, it's fundamentally it's a strategic human resource management challenge. So, you know, and this is where I'll go back to the reserves, because the reserves, the advantage of the reserves is you actually get paid, right? And that actually makes it a better value proposition than a purely volunteer organization, because you can still do all kinds of interesting work, but you do get a paycheck. Now, the question is, what makes that job better than, and I mentioned this in a response, in one of the typed responses, what makes to a young person, what makes joining the reserves more appealing than working at McDonald's? Because if you work at McDonald's, you can work Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and you can still sleep in your bed at home. You can go have a beer with your friends in the evening. But if you work in the reserves, you get on a bus on Friday night, you sleep in a tent for Friday night, Saturday night, and you show back, you know, you're back home on Sunday afternoon. And depending on the number of hours you would have worked at McDonald's, you might be making the same money. So how are we competing with the McDonald's of the world? And that doesn't even start when you start talking about a young engineering student at Concordia or McGill saying, well, I can join the reserves, but then I got to spend my summers in Gagetown doing trades qualification training. But my buddies are interning at WSP or Stantec or Ellis Don or SNC-Lavalin. So they're networking and getting internships in companies that they would potentially work for after they graduate. So how does the reserves compete with that? We don't. You know, even the scholarship program, I mentioned this in the text, it's $2,500 a year for 4 years. It's been that same number since like 2002. 10 grand went a lot further 25 years ago than it does today. Why hasn't that changed, right? Why haven't they doubled it? Why haven't they tripled it? Why haven't they made part-time salary for reservists tax-free? Because why not? Because what happens to reservists? Once they get a job after they graduate and they start moving up the tax bracket, the value prop becomes less and less appealing when 50% of what you're making as a reservist corporal is being taken away in taxes. So at a certain point, when you have a spouse, when you have children, it comes back to time. How much time do you have to give to something other than all the other things in your life? And that's where, to me, it comes, you know, that's the real problem that we need to solve. If we want to address this whole notion of emergency preparedness and people willing to give time to address this problem, we need to create human resource structures that are appealing to people to want to give that time to solve those problems. And the CAF has a beautiful value proposition, serving your country, right? So like that's a huge edge that it has over a lot of other sort of private and parapublic organizations. It just needs to make it a little bit more robust in that, in my opinion. So I'll end it there, Alex. But that's kind of pulling on some of the different elements and the questions that I saw in the chats. Thanks.
Oh, definitely, and I appreciate the commentary as well as just the whole approach you've taken in terms of proposing, you know, the value proposition for the reserves overall. I think it's a big solution moving forward, or at least a solution orientation that future reports we're going to publish with CGEM and IPD have to take into account. And we appreciate you on the panel, as well as Christiane and Shawna as well. So just as before we go to the closing remarks, turning over to Shawna for her final thoughts, and then I'll give us a little bit of a wrap up here.
Thank you, Alexander. I appreciate that. My final thoughts on this is I agree with what Dan is saying on the reserve front, that you have a ready body of paid individuals who come with a code of conduct and under the NDA, you know, everything is kind of in place for them from a governance perspective to respond. Because when the federal government intervenes, whether it's the regular force, the reserve force, it's a response-based approach, right? The wildfires here, how can we help? What do you need? Type of thing. Where someone where I'm looking at it more from is, the public need to be part of that solution from the onset. And what I'd love to see is that we start to build up the mitigation and preparedness and focus on localized, regional, and provincial response and recovery, where we establish a layered approach for capacity and response there so that we're better prepared. If we look at, I think, Christian, you mentioned about Germany before, and there's some cultural elements there I don't know that would apply here, but there's models, New Zealand, Australia, Japan. I just came back from Japan visiting 2 different centers on earthquake warning and preparedness and talking with various scholars and academics on how they manage that. But there's a culture in Japan for everyone to be involved in that response. I'm not sure we're there yet in Canada, but we're not going to be there ever if we keep relying on just a response-focused entity to come in and help us after it's all happened. If we can get to a place where we have a modernized approach for emergency management, that we have a holistic, intervention that starts with mitigation, that preparedness, the response and recovery building, and assets available to the provinces to help bring it all together. Maybe we do have to have some assets in place that are centralized to help in a surge capacity reality. Maybe we do have to look at a lessons learned center, for example. The way we learn now about lessons identified, and that is through sharing in forums like this, or by our colleagues sharing an after action review or a report or what have you. We need an identified center of lessons learned for disaster and emergency management in Canada that allows us to take lessons learned in the East and apply them in the West and vice versa. These types of things can happen with a more national approach, but I think we have to be very careful that we integrate any kind of national response with a localized holistic community approach, because nobody knows their community like the people that live in it. And when we even look at the rebuilding and recovery of Jasper today, if you're not putting goods and services in a community, no one's coming back to live there. So how are we integrating the economic disaster elements? How are we rebuilding with all of the new land situations they're going to have after these fires? We're now starting to see the landslides, the water where people can't rebuild. All of that comes from local knowledge. So there's an element, yes, for masses to come in for that surge capacity at the beginning, but I think we need an integrated, holistic approach that brings it all together. We need to flip that pyramid in emergency management so we are spending more down here on the mitigation and less up here on response and recovery. We need to flip that around, and we're not there yet. How do we get there? We get there by having conversations like this and raising all these really valuable points. And I really appreciate you having let me have a chance to raise some of my concerns and some of my thoughts on this topic. Thank you.
Definitely, and thank you for that comment, Shawna. And there's the representation there from Scott Cameron, a previous panelist we had on a different webinar with CGEM as part of this project we've done as our 4th now and our last one prior to the policy workshops coming to Ottawa as part of SEPSA in the fall. So we do appreciate that insight, and we appreciate obviously all the panelists we've had come on, but specifically for our speakers here, thank you again for attending this webinar. I'm really grateful personally to have hosted you here for this pertinent discussion. These are topics near and dear to my heart, and the community definitely is richer for the knowledge you've provided here today. And hopefully the policy reports that we do generate out of this include some of these solutions-oriented approaches and can provide some insight into D&D, into looking into what they want to build out of the military, out of D&D at large, and just obviously for community resilience through basically Public Safety Canada, but also the Government of Canada overall. I'll remind everybody just on behalf of Christian that there was a special issue of the Canadian Military Journal on Climate Security that was just published, and there's a special issue on the reserves forthcoming in the future. So definitely continue engaging through IPD and CGEM and the various links and websites that we've provided to you throughout the course of both panels today that continue engaging in these discussions and that provide the forums that Shawna mentioned where we engage and talk about these solutions and at least prepare ideas that prepare us to move forward within the emergency management community. As well, Styles mentions his own comparative international volume on domestic operations across allies and partners, and it's forthcoming or Springer by the end of the calendar year. And we'll continue engaging in the foreign policy and the domestic considerations that exist both through IPD as the prudent realism piece, and as we look at continuing the cross-pollination between the different environments, be it in the security environment, be it in emergency management, community resilience, business continuity, and the vast collaborations we've done between CGEM and the various different institutions and organizations over the course of the past year within this MINDS project. So really for the guests and viewers, I hope you've taken something away from the webinar today, be it the morning panel or this afternoon. Thank you for everyone that did make it through to both panels to the end here. We remain open to the fostered discussion pertaining to the items. You'll see that on the YouTube channel for IPD in the next couple of days, the recordings will be available, and I'll be touching base privately with the panelists after this. I'm looking forward to continuing to moderate many more discussions like this, hopefully with some of these panelists again in future events on similar and aligned topics. Outside of that, I wish you a good day and a good rest of your week leading into the long weekend. Thank you for being here with us today, everyone.